Good morning, everyone. My name is Jean Porter. I teach in the Theology department here at the University of Notre Dame, and it is my great honor and pleasure this morning to be with you all and to introduce Professor Abdullahi Ahmed An-Naim, who is the Charles Howard Candler Professor of Law Emeritus at Emory University and a Senior Fellow of the Center for the Study of Law and Religion. He received his Ph.D. from the University of Edinburgh, his law degree with honors, and his diploma in criminology from the University of Cambridge, and his degree in law from the University of Khartoum. He will be speaking to us this morning on religious nationalism, political and legal perspectives. So join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor An-Naim. Thank you.
So thank you very much. I'm really honored and pleased to be with you this morning. And I appreciate the flexibility and the courtesy of the organizers and their technical staff for facilitating my virtual participation, because I was hoping to be there in person to greet and reconnect with some old friends and colleagues, and also to be there, for the freshness of the spring weather in South Bend. But unfortunately, I'm recovering from spine surgery. And my calculation that I would be well enough to be able to travel and at least participate in some other way has been misplaced. Now I am happy to be at least in this mode with you this morning. The subject that has been assigned to me as part of the webinar is about religious nationalism, legal and theoretical and political perspectives. I am from Sudan, and I'm still from Sudan. I'm one of those people who never left, although I lived out of Sudan for almost 40 years, more than 40 years actually, since the mid-1980s, and for very much the same reasons that we are talking about this morning. It was to do with religious persecution, to do with exile because of political activism to protect human rights and fundamental freedoms that forced me out of the country, forced me out of my teaching position at the University of Khartoum, and eventually ended up in the United States, happily at Emory Law School ever since the 1990s. So the issues are not theoretical for me. They are very immediate and practical. In fact, I am part of a movement now, what we call ourselves a movement for restoration of peace and stability in Sudan, to try to combat the recent war and to resolve the tensions that have created massive destruction and human suffering. Now, this brings me to a couple of opening remarks that I wanted to make, that in a way, ironically, the idea of tension and conflict of ideas, of institutions, of relationships is inherent to the human condition, has always been with us, and probably will continue to be with us. The question is, how much are we able to mediate? And I always like to use the term mediate rather than the resolve. How can we mediate these tensions in a way that makes human existence more tolerable or more enjoyable for people, rather than expecting it to be totally eliminated or totally restored, removed from our lives. So in that sense, the tension between, and almost like it's obvious, how can you talk about religious nationalism? Because the two ideas are mutually exclusive. They are jealous sort of competitors. They don't accept sharing the stage. They don't accept sharing people's loyalties and commitments and value systems and so on. And yet, we have to find ways of reconciling the two that we cannot do without and we cannot do with. You know, the classic, what Americans call catch-22, in the sense that there is no possibility of life without religion, at least in human experience so far, and there is no possibility of organized political existence without nationalism. And yet the two ideas seem to be competing and reconcilable, and yet they have to be reconciled somehow. That is the location that I'm trying to put my position in myself in to try to present these ideas to you. I already referenced Sudan. I will referencing it a few times in my remarks because it's an immediate. It is something that I live with every day. And it's something I see my families and my friends suffering daily. For hundreds of thousands of Sudanese have been forced out of their homes. Hundreds of thousands have suffered death and destruction of their property. And this war has been going on for 2 years. It is a war, and it has been going on for 2 years. We are not, I think, we don't have this time unless you wish to, in this question and answer, revisit these issues. But the complexity of the outplay of ideological and cultural and political factors, as well as geopolitical factors in the current war or all wars, as we look around the world now, is obvious to us. And we can talk about that if you wish. But what I wanted to say is that somehow the risk and costs are rising. That whereas war and destruction and the stupidity of human beings killing each other like this has been with us all along, but the costs and are mounting. The human cost and the material cost is mounting. And our ability to inflict pain and suffering on each other is unfortunately rising by our ability to resolve as well and to mediate. So hopefully we can match the two in a way that we can say we can go forward with a human quality of life without having to suffer in this way. I asked for a handout to be given to you so that you can follow what I'm saying broadly. But I speak here about what I just finished talking about is the introduction part. But I will move on to talk about what I call the imperatives of incremental success. Again, here I am a post-colonial subject, meaning that I am from Sudan. I was born under British colonial rule of Sudan in the 1950s, 40s and 50s, and I have lived all my life in that experience in the region. So when I say post-colonial, it is not an academic term; it is a very much lived experience, and by imperative of post-colonial mediation and incremental success, I say, is again part of that same attitude of trying to maintain a degree of optimism that we can go forward with our lives and our human quality of life, despite the contradictions and the tensions that we live with. And again, it's a question about the same tension between exploitation and repression, between exclusive control and manipulation versus the drive and the impulse to be free and to celebrate life in its fullest for us as human beings. I have a book. Of course, academics can't help plugging in for something like that. A book called African Constitutionalism and the Role of Islam. It was published by University of Pennsylvania Press in 2006. In that book, I try to explain in the first chapter what I mean by incremental success. That African constitutionalism is not a failure and is not yet a success, and probably will continue to be between the two, but it is incremental, meaning that we should not be despondent about the speed and the sort of consistency of our progress in these human pursuits, because it is in the nature of the experience itself that it is incremental. We build on what we achieve, and we try to maintain a higher level of it over time as we go forward. But at the same time, it is not a call for complacency. Because I mean that the danger is to say, okay, it can't be helped. This is the way it is. It's ups and downs. It is fits and starts. Yes, but we have our human agency to be accountable for and to be accounted or considered in this formulation. That it is not, of course, I mean, believers, of course, we can't talk about religion without talking about issues like fundamental choices and human being choices to do or not to do, to be or not to be. But the position that I take from an Islamic point of view is that we are both responsible, although we understand that there is a master plan that is running the universe. And the question is therefore not to abandon our individual responsibility and despondency that we can't be held, it cannot be held to transform. But it's the question of to what extent can we do to make a difference in our life conditions and so on. Part of that effort is what I call reimagining. Again, the exercise of reimagining is something that it is in our human capacity to do, that we can reimagine possibilities. Of course, the very idea of reimagining means that it is not the way it is, but the way it can be. And the human agency that I speak of is how to fill the gap between what is and what can be. So that the human agency of the subject, of the human subject, is to create conditions whereby the possibilities of coexistence, possibilities of reconciliation, mediation can be enhanced over time in different contexts. Again, here, I'll go back to the question of Sudan in a minute, but I wanted to make sure that we understand that when I speak of Sudan, it is not that far removed from where we are or what we experience. And probably that is one of the fallacies and the illusions of our human suffering, is that we tend to think of, oh no, we are exceptional. We are not really that bad. Our conditions are not really that dire and so on, which is, of course, is a fallacy. And that, you know, the recent human experience, recent human history can show, or has shown repeatedly, how as we speak, things are repeated which should not have been and could not have been avoided if we just simply applied our human agency effectively and creatively. So it is the ability that we have now with the media and with these types of settings and the technology that enables us to communicate in this way is to enable us to reflect on our respective experiences in a way that is instructive for our struggles, but also useful for others to draw on and to benefit from. It is not total isolation. It is not total dependency and integration either. And again, the human imagination of creating that, bridging that gap is what we're talking about here. Again, to draw on a couple of ideas that I will draw on later on, because part of my title is legality and constitutionalism and human rights, these ideas and their effectiveness and usefulness in the mediation of the tensions that we are talking about here. That I speak here about these are tools, not outcomes or results. There is nothing automatic about it. It's a question of what we do with it rather than by just simply turning on a switch, things will happen or not happen. Things will happen or not happen by our ability as human agents to control events around us in our lives rather than expecting those events to control themselves for our benefit. Legal systems, as I say, are therefore tools and are not ready answers. I spoke about the post-colonial earlier on, that as a post-colonial subject, we know that our what we now call our legal systems are a product of our colonial experience. So they are not totally indigenous to our situation, our history, our experiences, our cultures, our values. Yet, they are a reality that we live to live by and to live with. Meaning that it is not something that we can just simply shed by saying, oh no, we are independent, we can do as we please. No, we can't. And we know that we cannot. And we don't really want to do as we please. And if we really are left to our own devices, we will probably be worse off than we are at this point. And that is where I would like to introduce my subject in relation to Sudan in particular. Sudan became independent in 1946 from Anglo-Egyptian rule at that time. People tend to think or to forget that rule was the co-partner of Britain in colonizing Sudan. And before that, for 4,000 years, Egypt has continued to colonize Sudan. But since the turn of the century, with the overthrow of the Mahdist state, which was a religious state in Sudan, that was attempting to do what we are saying it cannot be done, and it failed to do it. And now another sort of band of reckless leaders are attempting to repeat the same mistakes. Let me again, not to get ahead of myself here, that the Mahdist state was doomed to fail and did fail, and the cost was horrendous. The population of Sudan at the time, when the Mahdists took over in the mid-1880s, was about 8 million people. By the time the Mahdist state was overthrown by Anglo-Egyptian invasion, the population was reduced to 1.5 million, from 8 million to 1.5 million. So that was the magnitude of the cost. And yet people's egos and illusions to think that somehow we can repeat the past, we can recover our glorious, and it was not that glorious anyway. You know, if you are honestly about with ourselves, we know that it was not glorious. But we tend to glorify and to magnify the beauty and the power of our past and to minimize the possibilities of transformation and change. And we know that that is not the case. So the British ruled with the Egyptian assistance and support. They were sort of second in command to the Egyptians, to the British throughout the 50s, 50 years of British rule in Sudan. When they were leaving, they left a Sudan that was almost like a time bomb. And you will see that, with all due respect, I don't know if I can use the term like this, the British have done this repeatedly. They tend to leave behind what will ensure their return and will ensure their continued control and manipulation of people's life and situations. So as some of you may be aware, the question of the South Sudan, which was a closed district for the rest of Sudan for at least 30 years through colonial administration from the 19 teens until the 1950s, 40s. Meaning that Sudanese of the northern Sudan could not travel freely into South Sudan, of the south could not travel into the north. The two regions were kept separate, and they called the policy is called closed district policy. But obviously, the result was that when independence was achieved, it was not attainable as a united Sudan because it was not integrated as such. And predictably, there was a war that resulted in the separation of the South Sudan, which unfortunately did not end the political instability of the South, as we recently seen tragically in the news. Neither has it ended the instability in the North either. But continuing with the North for the time being, Northern Sudan, which came to be the Republic of Sudan, and the other one was now the Republic of South Sudan. It continued to be suffering from instability, tensions that are of the same quality and magnitude that we have suffered with the South. So it turned out that the problems of national integration and national unity and solidarity were almost symptoms of the same problem in the South, in the North, in any part of the North and South. And tragically, as some of you may have followed the news, this is precisely what is driving the current war in Sudan. That the inability of Northern Sudanese, now called so-called Sudanese, to coexist peacefully and with dignity and equal citizenship is precisely what drove the South away and what is breaking the North up into different regions and different warring factions. The issue of our subject of our this morning discussion about religious nationalism is crucial to that, because for historical reasons, the way Islam came into Sudan, into that part of East Africa, now we call Sudan, which is part of the Sudanic belt, which extends all the way from Senegal to Somalia. But our part is the Nile Valley, Sudan. Islam came from different regions, some from North Africa, some from West Africa, some from across the sea, from Arabia. And that, ironically, or rather interestingly, contributed to the type of Islam that we have. We don't have a single Islam. And that's one of the illusions that Sudanese Muslims tend to think that, oh, Islam is Islam, there's nothing. But no, actually, it's not. It has never been historically, it cannot be now. And it has always been a question of, in fact, ability to adapt different currents of Islamic thinking and practice, from the Sufi variety to the populist Africanist variety, throughout the region, not only in Sudan, but throughout West Africa as well, as some of you, I'm sure, are aware of the history. Therefore, it was an opportunity to create what I call that mediation of tension in a way that would have created a quality of coexistence and a quality of Islam that included and accommodated all Sudanese equally with human dignity and rights. But the illusion that there's something called an Islamic State, and the illusion that there's something called Sharia, which this so-called Islamic State should enforce by law, that illusion has been sustained in different modes and ways throughout Muslim history by different types of colonial and neo-colonial administrations, because colonialism did not come to the region with Western colonialism. Of course, there was, to begin with, going back, there was Arab colonialism, and then there was Persian colonialism, and then all varieties of colonialism, which persist, of course, up to the present time. In fact, what we see now in the current war in Sudan is a reflection of that as well. A competition between so-called African and Middle Eastern dimensions of identity of Sudanese Muslims. So those are the factors that contribute, and I'm sure that there's so much we can say about this, and maybe we'll come to revisit this in the discussion time. But just to note that these tensions are not new. Now, I made some bold statements when I said that there is no such thing as an Islamic State. Never has been, never can be. There is no such thing as Sharia. Never has been, never can be. These are concepts and ideas that, in fact, are not original to Islam itself. In fact, for centuries, Muslims lived without any notion of an Islamic State, without any pretensions or aspirations to establish an Islamic State. Not only that, but I argue that I have a book again here, I have to do this. It's called Islam and the Secular State, in which I try to explain the fallacy of the notion of an Islamic State. It is a fallacy because the day the Prophet ﷺ died and before he was buried, Muslims disagreed fundamentally on these same issues that they continue to be divided with today or by today, as we see, for example, in the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Amazing how a schism that started in 7th century Arabia, in Medina, when the Prophet died and before he was buried, continues with us until now as we speak, when we see it flaring again and again in the Middle East region. So there is nothing new about this. And there has never been a time when Muslims were united or were consistent in their understanding. In fact, there is a hadith that is attributed to the Prophet ﷺ that says that Jews have been divided into 71 faction or group or section, and Christians have been divided into 72, and Muslims will be divided into 73. Of course, I mean, those sort types of predictions and hadiths are difficult to prove, and they may or not have been said by the Prophet anyway, but the point remains that, in fact, there is a vast variety of what it means to be Muslim, historically and presently. And if you look all the way from China to West Africa, and from Indonesia to Central Asia to Western Europe, and you can see the variety of what it means to be Muslim that are totally irreconcilable. You cannot really be a Muslim in that sense and this sense at the same time. You cannot be a Shia Muslim and a Sunni Muslim, let alone within the Shia and within the Sunni. And the factions continue to multiply. So the point, therefore, is that division and schisms are inherent. And by the way, it's something to be celebrated, in fact. If we can create conditions for it to be accommodated and to mediate it. Because it is the possibility of human creativity and self-expression. One point that as an exile from Sudan, I say as a heretic, actually, that's why I left Sudan, Murtad. I say that the possibility of this belief is inherent to the possibility of belief. If I cannot disbelieve, then I cannot believe either. It is as fundamental as that. I need the space, I need the possibility of disbelieving in Islam itself, in everything else, as much as I need the ability to believe. And I will not have one without the other. That's my conviction. And it goes across the board all the way to every type of institutions and religious experience. So in the case of Islam, I'm Muslim. Therefore, it is not possible to have an Islamic state. It never happened historically. It is inherently impossible. Why? Because Muslims always disagree about what it is to be Muslim and how to be Muslim. And that ability to disagree is integral to their ability to agree on anything, including Islam itself, in any sense or meaning of it. So that is the nature of history. And again, you can read this for yourself everywhere in experiences across the region, all the way, as I say, from China. By the way, we don't think of China as Muslim, but in fact, there are 10 million Chinese Muslims who live now in China. 10 million. They are the largest Muslim population in the world is Indonesia, as you know. Second to it is probably Pakistan by now, or India, or between the two of them, it was recently contested as to which is the second and which is the third. But in any case, the Indian subcontinent has more Muslims than the entire Middle East and North Africa. So we tend to think of Islam as Middle Eastern, but in fact, Islam is more South Asian, is more Central Asian, is more Southeast Asian than it has ever been or can be Middle Eastern, so-called. And the Middle East itself is a colonial term that we know. So therefore, you just remember I mentioned earlier about the possibility of comparative reflection. There are benefits, but there are limitations. And one of the benefits is to understand the perspective of the proportionality of what it is to be Muslim and who decides what it is to be Muslim. Who defines what Islam is. Therefore, if we cannot have a means of agreeing or sort of establishing a shared understanding of Islamicity of anything, of the state, of religious experience, of lifestyle, the quality of being Muslim itself, if you cannot agree on how it can be achieved by whom, or to what ends, then we cannot have any meaningful discussion of the ideas here. So I move on to try to cover some of the subjects that I highlighted in my outline for you to consider. Therefore, the case of Sudan is, as I say, tragic, but also very instructive. What's going on in Sudan now was not inevitable and could end any day as we speak. But it's not going to end without Muslim Sudanese achieving that for themselves, by themselves. I don't believe in global dynamics of power and superpowers and this and that, who can bring peace here and take it out of there. It is always people who enable colonial powers and new colonial powers to do or fail to do, to get away with or not. And therefore, it is us who have to come to terms with this. And for us to come to terms with this, we have to abandon this illusion of an Islamic state and this illusion of Islamic nationalism. It is an illusion, and it has led to tremendous suffering throughout the region. And we see it not only in Sudan, we see it in Pakistan, Bangladesh, we see it throughout the region, in Somalia, in East Africa generally. And so it's amazing how it is a constant presence in our life and imagination to say, oh no, look at this, what's happening here, what's happening there. I need to think, oh no, we are the exception. We can make it work where everybody else failed. No, we cannot. And we should not even try. And we, so long as we keep sort of arrogantly and persistently trying to make it work, we are going to inflict suffering on ourselves, on our neighbors, and our families, and so on. So therefore, the experience of Sudan is instructive, but also it has its limitations because the geopolitical factors that created Sudan the way it is now are the ones that are shaping the way it can evolve into the future. So it is not free of that history and geopolitical and sociological conditioning and makeup of the population. But again, it is not even inevitable. That is, we can find models of trying to break away from that historical experience. Now, I come to the point about how to get out of this, how to break away from the limitations and the possibilities of the conflict that we have had and the possibilities of mediation that we can have. That the experience of Sudan, as it has been with many other Muslim majority countries that have come independent throughout the 20th century, is that crisis of identity. We are somehow unable to accept that we are only Muslims, and we cannot be only Muslims. We have to be other things too, whether we like it or not. And Islam itself does not require or expect us to be Muslims and nothing but Muslims. Nobody is anything and but anything. With all due respect, sir, look around you in this room. You will see that this to be the case. So there is no possibility of being only Muslims. And there is no need to try to be only Muslims. Because we are tied by economic and political and sociological and other factors to all other human societies. And we talk about globalization now, we talk about global integration now, and these are realities. They are not going on the terms that we would like them to proceed, but we also understand that there is no escaping those factors. They are here to stay. Therefore, it is the possibility of how to create conditions for coexistence, for sharing of power, sharing of resources, from the tiniest to the largest communities, from within the family to the so-called nation. And by the way, the term nation itself, that's why I had hesitated to use the term religious nationalism or otherwise, because nationalism itself is loaded with tensions in the sense that on whose terms? People talk about American this, American that, or Mexican this, Canadian this, but these are huge simplifications. If you talk about any level, Arab nationalism, that's absurd. Talk about it is racist and it is just power tools to manipulate and to control each other as communities. So those are the terms that we have to come to accept and to work with, to understand that our tensions are not permanent, but they are also inherent to our condition, but also they are mediatable. If I don't know if that is the term I can use, they are open to mediation. The tension that I'm driving at here is with neo-colonial, because like it or not, including this country, we are all post-colonial. We are a product of colonial experiences. We brought colonialism and we are suffering from colonialism and experiencing it as we go forward. It is no longer possible to be exempt from that. Even the most privileged who think that they are immune. In fact, they are, in a way or another, suffering for it. But it is not. It doesn't have to be that suffering. It can be a creative force in our lives. If you can understand how it can work to mediate rather than to sustain tensions. What really is destructive is hinging those ideas to fixed, predetermined concepts of anything: religion, Islam, nationalism, a nation, whatever it is, so long as it is non-negotiable, it is deadlock. It is going to lead to confrontation and conflict. Whereas any of those can be creative force in our lives if we keep it flexible and fluid, as it should be, as it is in fact in life itself. Life is fluid. If you allow me to mention my back surgery here, I was suffering for many years for this. And now I have undergone a tremendous surgery that hope to relieve me of this, or promise to relieve me of this. And it is a promise that I await and struggle to sustain and to achieve. But to understand that it was critical to the way I was, and it will continue to be part of the way I will be or can be in the future. So that is the nature of the human. In Arabic term, it's called barzakh, an in-between. The human is an in-between. It is never of this or the other. And I'm sure that these terms are familiar to you in whatever tradition that you identify with. The so-called devil and angel. Actually, the human is neither devil nor angel, neither this nor the other. It is both, and yet none of those. And that is a mediation that we're talking about here. So the idea of the post-colonial is what I'm talking about here to try to present my final thought for this presentation, which is to understand that, again, I hate to do this, but my latest, but I hope not last book, is called Decolonizing Human Rights. Decolonizing Human Rights. It was published in 1922 or 21, I think, by Cambridge University Press. It's a tiny volume. I think you'll find it in the library. You can read it in an afternoon. But the point, which is for me an achievement, but the point for me is that probably will be my project for life, which is to understand how human rights are colonized, human rights can be decolonized, and must be decolonized to be human rights at all. But their decolonization is not going to be achieved in one stroke of just one morning we open a door or a window and here is the glorious morning of the post-colonial. It is incremental. It is a process of creating conditions and relationships and building on achievements of different human societies and so on. The critical point in that concept of decolonizing human rights is to understand that it is, by their nature, human rights ought to be defined by the people for themselves and to be implemented by themselves. That no human being can define human rights for any other human being. So I have to have the ability to define and the ability to implement and the ability to achieve in order to realize the promise of universality of human rights. And yet we have been raised and expectations have been, I studied law in the 1950s, as was mentioned earlier on, and we were taught, and I went to Cambridge and in Britain, UK, and I studied and came to the US where I practiced or teach, have been for decades, that human rights are Western, human rights are liberal, human rights are this and that. And of course, by definition, if you call it liberal, they are not humanized by virtue of being liberal. If you call them Western, they are not universally humanized by virtue of being Western. The very idea of saying human rights are Western defies the possibility of universality of human rights. And yet it sounds like an illusion. How can you have universal human rights protection without having a consensus on it? Yes, have a consensus. The question is how to produce that consensus in a way that's inclusive to all perspectives and ideas. And if I may come back to the sort of concluding with the reflections on the title of this talk, the notion of religious nationalism is a tension in itself. How can it be religious and nationalism at the same time? Yet we all have this drive to identify our nationalism with some sort of religious affiliation. Even those who think of ourselves as liberal or as secular or even atheist, in fact, there is a religious affiliation that we are reacting to, whether we are accepting or rejecting. And it's not going to stay away because it's around us all the time. So that is, in the title, we have this notion. And the political and the legal perspectives that I mentioned are tools. They are not solutions as such. And they are tools that are again, they are what we make of them. Which is the glorious thing about tools, is that it is at the same time an acknowledgement of the limitations of what we have to work with, but also a potential for its ability to transcend those limitations. For us to be able to be, for me, to be a Sudanese and an American, by the way, I happen to be an American citizen also for almost 25 years now, to be of this world and that world, to be a human rights activist and to be a Muslim. These days we live in the last days of Ramadan, and we experience Ramadan in our family every day, every evening, obviously. So to be all of that at the same time is what it is to be human. And yet it has to be in a way that creates sustainability, not create tension and disruption for myself and everybody else. And which brings me back to the notion of mediation. The legal and constitutional possibilities, which I think I referenced earlier on, but they are part of that human achievement that we have realized over time. We created institutions, we created instruments. With all due respect, I don't need or want to be too political here this morning, but we experience in this country now what this country has been about from the very beginning, which is the ability to achieve a balance between competing powers, between competing perspectives, for coexistence and yet for creativity and embracing change and the idea of the liberal as emancipatory. And all of these are in our institutions. They are not in the abstract. They cannot be sustained in the abstract. And what we experience as we read the newspapers this morning and yesterday, we see that institutions are alive with these tensions and with these contradictions and impossibilities, which is tremendously heartening for me. Not that I identify with this view or the other view, but the fact that the two coexist and the two can negotiate their coexistence and create possibilities of fundamental development and evolution. The American experience, I call it the American experience in the broader sense of the term, has given humanity tremendous achievements. Federalism is one of them. Federalism is a uniquely American institution. And all the constitutionalism concepts that we have and experience, the First Amendment is an American achievement to humanity, not only to the United States or to the people of North America. So these are what I mean about contesting and creativity that gives us resources that we can work with. I'm happy to revisit any of these ideas in our discussion, and I think the shorter I keep my introduction, the better for our discussion. So I will end with this and open for discussion in any aspect of what I was saying or have failed to say so far. Thank you very much.
I'm sure you all agree with me in thanking Professor An-Naim for a really stimulating and inspiring talk. Let's take a few moments of silence to reflect on some questions we might like to bring to him. And then I will take the privilege of the moderator to ask a question myself, and we'll get started. All right. So if I could begin, I'm not sure if you hear me, Professor An-Naim?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a really inspiring talk, and it was a very hopeful talk. And I think we all at certain points can use a certain amount of hopefulness today. But I found that, especially near the end of your remarks, I was left with a little concern mixed in with the hope. You hold out a vision for mutual cooperation and negotiation among different perspectives on what it is to be religious or to be a part of a nation or to claim a right. But doesn't that process presuppose that all parties buy into those ideals? If you're in a situation in which some parties to the conflict don't really seem to want to coexist with the others, they seem to want to sort of, how can I say this, in some hopefully nonviolent way do away with the other options. Doesn't that limit and undermine the possibilities of the kinds of mediating frameworks you want to build up?
Of course it does. And I think that was, I hope to have conveyed that point in my speaking about the incremental success. Mm-hmm. That it is not, if you look back in any experience, even within the family, let alone within a community or larger socio-economic and political entity, you'll see that there was a time when there was even less of a consensus on what that means to mediate and what it means to coexist. And there was more of a strident, violent, think of the 20th century and think of what humanity has been through in the 20th century. We have come from Nazis. We have come from Marxism in the extremist form. We have come from all sorts of repression and colonial and post-colonial experiences that people suffered from. And yet, we are not totally out there, but we are not there. We are not in that backwater either. So, I wish I could just give you a snap answer to your question, but I accept that contradiction and tensions are inherent to the human condition. But I equally accept that human agency is the possibility of transforming those tensions into possibilities of success. And that it is not that far back. In this country, with all due respect, I hate to bring this to, think of the civil rights movement in this country. Mm-hmm. Think of me as an African Muslim addressing you on this subject in this time, in this part of the world. And you realize that we have come a long way, really, honestly. Not that I live in Atlanta, after all, and I understand the tensions and the difficulties that my children and others suffer from, or and unfortunately continue to do. But also I understand that we have come a long way too. So what I plead for is a little patience, a little imagination, a little persistence, not defeatism and despondency.
All right, thank you so much. That was very helpful. We've got about half an hour, and so my understanding is that the questions are being filtered and they'll be sent to me to convey to you in just a moment.
Mm.
Let me see. That isn't them, is it? Let's see. There. It's the fifth keynote, right? We're getting there.
Heard anyone?
I could ask another question. While we're waiting, since I have a little extra time, let me follow up with another question. I wonder if you could comment on something on your handout that you didn't have a chance to talk about, and that is the role of legal systems. You say they can mediate power, but they're not inherently neutral. And how do we ensure they promote coexistence instead of repression? Could you say a little more about that? That's a fascinating subject.
I think that what I meant by that is that anything human is inherently shaped and colored by the perspectives and experiences. And I think in your first question, you mentioned that already, that we tend to we tend to shape and color and influence the outcome by trying to control the means that we create for the resolution or their production of the outcomes. And therefore, the legal institutions, I mean, again, think of the civil rights movement. Where had it started and where has it ended? And what made it come all the way that it did? And in some respects, it sounds like, or it feels like we are back to where we started. In some respects, we are far away from where we started. So my point with that remark is to say that let us be modest and pragmatic in our understanding of the possibilities and limitations. That we don't have this romantic notion, oh, everything is possible, let's do it right now and forever stop this foolishness and that and so on. We're only setting ourselves for disappointment if we take that posture. But at the same time, not to realize that there are limitations to what we are trying to do is also is counterproductive. I mean, can you think of anything human that is neutral? It is not possible. What is possible is to counterbalance competing perspectives on the issue. Not that we can have a neutral outcome of that issue that will materialize by itself. So that is what I mean by these are inherently biased, but there are tools, not results or outcomes. And there are tools that are useful to the extent that we make them so. One of the glorious sort of aspects of the teaching of my teacher, the one says Muhammad Taha, is to say that it is all in the human that we have the possibility. So the tension that I was referring to earlier on between competing claims, competing perspectives, competing this and that. It is in a way sounds like just setting complexity and multiplying complexity, but it's also multiplying possibilities of mediation of that complexity, because it is all in the human, and because we have seen how the human can be transformed. Think of any religious community, and really think of the early adherents of that religious community, and how they have transformed themselves and transformed the world around them. And you can see how these ideas of tension and bias are really what we make of them. You know, think of Christianity and its own history, think of Islam and its own history, think of Hinduism or any religion and its own history. And you can see that how these ideas have come to be created for us to use rather than to by themselves being the tools that we use.
Thank you. At this point, we're going to take questions from the floor. We do have a couple of mics. So if anyone would like to raise a question, could you please raise your hand and we'll call on you.
Hi, from here in the back. Oh, yes, name's Max. I'm connected to the Catholic worker in town. I am partly wondering, a lot of your appeals are rooted in sort of very, what we see as mainstream liberal Enlightenment argumentation and rationale, but I see a lot of the problem with discussing with Christian nationalists or religious nationalists more broadly is they don't buy into that. And I find that more and more people are not swayed by those Enlightenment arguments. When we're making the case to others, whether they be like Hindu nationalists in India, as you mentioned, or Islamic nationalists in Middle Eastern countries, what else can we appeal to other than the sort of common humanity when each of these traditions have very different anthropologies? That's where I guess I'm struggling, because we have a different sense of what it is to be human, what human rights are. So I don't know how appeals to common humanity will function when we disagree on what it means to be human at its core, what that direction would be.
Okay. May I? Shall I do something here? Or wait for the second question? Madam Chair? Okay.
All right.
I will attempt to respond to this question. Of course, I mean, where I come from, in fact, I'm an embodiment of that. Like, it is not, I was not like this all my life. And I don't know if I will stay this way. But so far, I have kept to these ideas and values, not because they are liberal Western Enlightenment ideas, but in fact, because I argue, and again, in my own writing, I have a website you can download and things that you can read to see that I argue for an Islamic rationale for human rights as an Islamic rationale for human rights, from an Islamic point of view, rooted in Muslim history, intellectual history, spiritual history, and in fact, if we insist that, these ideas can only be promoted through the Enlightenment and European this and that, then we are giving up on the possibility. Because for myself, I would not, and nobody I think that I can imagine would say, okay, let's give up everything else and just be Western liberal minded, this and that. But if you tell me that these values are not alien to my values, are not alien to my culture, that the idea of cultural legitimacy of human rights that I have argued for since the 1980s, and I have published in English since the 1980s. I have a book that came out in 1982 called Quest for Consensus, meaning that it is a consensus that we seek, not a consensus that we are given or born with. And by consensus, immediately we're talking about bringing competing ideas together, not by hegemony of one set of ideas over others. And in fact, much of the problems that we have now in the Middle East or elsewhere are due to the illusion that, oh, these ideas are Western, therefore we have to accept them or to take them or leave them as they are because this is the way it is. No, it is not the way it is. And I refuse to accept that this is the way it is. And it is, in fact, historically, factually, conceptually, in every sense, that is not the case. Not a single idea that came out of the Enlightenment was born in the Enlightenment by the Enlightenment itself. It all precedes the so-called Enlightenment. And what is the Enlightenment anyway? And how did it come about? What forces formed and shaped its trajectories and process? So that I think, my friend, if we really start with the premise that we start with, then there is no point in this meeting. We just go home and either accept the Western liberal way or die. But I refuse to accept the liberal Western way or die. Because I accept the possibility that I have within my own history, within my own tradition, the resources that I need to create universality of human rights from within an Islamic perspective. And you can read my writings on this. And in fact, many of it is also in lecture format that you can listen to.
Thank you. I think that we have a question over here. Or do we?
Yes. This is
All
a
right.
question from an online participant. I'm a pastor in Chicago, carrying the concerns of many in this gathering. I'm so grateful for the theological anthropology under your humble, wise framework today. What a gift for our staying power. Could you say more about concrete examples of what you're calling mediating significant social differences from the Sudanese experience that could be instructive for us today?
Okay. I wish I can cite so many of them because we need as many as we can muster. But I think that here again, I wish I had sort of decisive black and white answers. But the point is that in our experience in Sudan, it has not always been conflict. It has not always been tension. In fact, if that was the case, there wouldn't be no Sudan at all to speak of. But the fact that most of our history, we have lived, coexisted. We have created conditions. I'll give you examples of this. If you see how communities persist and survive through the current war, I follow news and I follow newsreel and I follow songs, in fact, and celebrations of how people wait a whole day for a handful of grain to survive on. And the next day they come back for it. But the point is that the next day it is there for them to come back to. I mean that Sudan has suffered a tremendous disaster. I mean, people can't really imagine how the magnitude of it. But of course, people are surviving through that. Khartoum used to be a city of 7 million people. Now it is probably 2 or 3 million of them who are still in the so-called greater Khartoum area. But they come and they stay, and even those who left came back as soon as there were any possibility for them to coexist. So I'm saying that the communal coexistence and collaboration and solidarity is inherent. It is obvious to see. But it is not, you are not going to find it in the newsreel of the sort of competing power mongers of the Muslim Brotherhood on the one hand and the Islam and دعم السريع on the rapid support group on the other. These are extreme factions are manipulating a phenomena to stay in power and to exploit communities. But we tend to overlook the communities that survive through all of this, and the communities that keep coming back for more of this. If you think of the recent political development on a so-called national scale, or if you think how people are trying to create a parallel government, to provide essential services, this takes tremendous collaboration among really inherently conflicting and power-mongering rivals for decades. They have come together in Nairobi. They have come together to draft a charter that is creating now possibilities. Not any of this is going to materialize overnight, but none of it will ever be realized without starting somewhere. And that somewhere is in the people consciousness and commitment to their lives as they know them. I hope this helps.
There's another hand up. If you could introduce yourself before you ask your question, please.
Colin Leach, Protestant pastor from Boston. Your talk is wonderful, sir, but it seems to me to be overly philosophical in the sense that it really doesn't take in the desperation of the masses. It's overly informed by your own personal perspective, and I want to tie that to the United States of America, and what is unaccounted for in this conference, by the way, but also in the political discussion, is that we have two countries economically in this country, and the bottom 50% have virtually zero assets. And so we talk philosophically about human rights and what should happen, but that 50% wants something now, and that is understandable. And that's what I think is missing from your ideas of mediation. And I wonder if you respond to that.
Okay. If I may invoke my own personal experience, I grew up in Sudan in the 1940s and 50s. I studied and went back to teach in Sudan throughout the 80s. And I was imprisoned in Sudan for the very ideas that I'm talking about now. So there is nothing philosophical or abstract about this. My teacher was executed in Sudan in 1985 for advocating these ideas. 1985. So it is not an abstraction. It's not a lack of awareness. It is a lived experience that we have. But some of us have to maintain a vision of optimism precisely in order to uplift the struggle from the misery of the 50%. Of course, there are more than 50%, obviously. I would say there are 75, 80% of the population of the United States is what we are talking about. But those are not, you are not going to appeal to them by saying, well, look, just simply nothing can be achieved. It is all abstractions and ideas and philosophy that is has no meaning in real life and so on. People die by this. And how can we say that it has no meaning or value? If now Sudanese are dying in the hundreds of thousands to defend their human dignity and identity as human beings, citizens of the same country equally, how can we say that this is only a mere abstraction? But it is just that it is not in our consciousness, in our media, therefore it is absent, it's not real. Let's question our media. Let's question our consciousness. And look to see where it does exist. Not that we don't see enough of it and waiting for it to come to our living rooms. Thank you.
Other questions? I saw a hand back here and then a gentleman here.
My name is Mike Forbes. I'm a fellow here at the University of Notre Dame. Why is it all right for us to kill all these Sudanese? It seems to be all right to kill millions of Sudanese, but not struggle with that whole concept, which I believe is a failure of the United States. But if you could you talk about why is it all right for us to kill all these Sudanese, and yet we as United States, we seem to ignore that problem?
Unfortunately, it is not an American problem. It is a human problem. Unfortunately, all human societies have historically suffered for this. The lack of empathy, the lack of understanding of our shared humanity and commitment to our shared values is something that has always been with us. But I would argue, in my earlier noted optimism, is something that we are emerging from incrementally over time. If you think of the struggle of the United States itself, of segments of this population over the last 30, 40 years, over the last 10, 15 years, even as we speak, you'll see that there is, in fact, a growing sharing of values that is emerging out of those experiences. That it is, again, learning from our mistakes and building on our achievements. To understand that the United States of today is not the United States of the 1960s. Is not the United States of the Civil War, let alone or the Civil Rights Movement. And the United States of tomorrow will not be the United States of today. But none of it will be achieved or realized by wishing it, but by engaging in the change process for ourselves immediately. For example, the idea that we tend to think of human experiences as sort of segmented. This is going on in North America, but it's not affecting in Southeast Asia or Africa and so on. Is being sort of undermined and destroyed every day. That we realize that what we think we achieve for our benefit and privilege is in fact at the cost of that privilege and achievements. And that, I think, your question, sir, to me is an indication precisely of what we are talking about. That you do care, and that you do realize that the current situation is unsustainable, and that we have the power to transform it, and that's where we need to start. But it has to be a starting point at some point. And, again, I quoted my teacher earlier on. One of his comments, he used to say that change is constant. That every day, every time, every morning I wake up, I have the potential to transform myself and to transform my situation from the previous day. That there is nothing sort of forgone or forsaken about it. And therefore, that realization, and the media, Early on, I lamented the sort of the lack of focus in the media, but also realized the possibilities and potential of the media. The fact that I am able to reach and to address you with these remarks across this continent and across the world, in fact, culturally and intellectually, in terms of my own experience and life, is a hopeful sign for me that we have something to build on.
Thank you. We have time for at least one more question, and there was a gentleman who had raised his hand. So if someone could, I know he needs a mic.
Well, my name is George Enderle. I'm a professor emeritus here in the business school at Notre Dame. I would like to first to thank you that you are talking about decolonializing human rights. If you look at the history of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was an outcome or a reaction to the Holocaust and to all the atrocities of the Second World War and Hitler and fascism, etc., there was a consensus of religious leaders and non-religious leaders, including the Soviet Union and Poland and other countries from the Soviet states. They said we agree on the content of those human rights, and it was the representative of India who introduced it's not only about men, but it's about women also. And the representative of China who talks about it's not only about reason, but also conscience, our conscience. And so I'm very pleased to see that how you understand human rights in that concrete and deep sense. And I just want to thank you for that and say that I think we have to learn the human rights language again, because we don't understand it. We think it's just a heritage of the Enlightenment, and that's wrong historically. But it is extremely important today if we look at the wars in Sudan, at the wars in Ukraine, at the wars in Gaza, Palestine. And so thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this encouraging conclusion of my remarks and positive reading of what I was trying to say. And I think that is what we hope to achieve in a meeting like this, is to understand that what you mentioned about the progression of consensus globally, from the Universal Declaration to the looking now to the post sort of hopefully capitalist understanding of profit and interest and benefits and social change and environmental change, and so the horizon is expanding, but we can't really push without reinforcing what we have achieved. Therefore, it is the possibility of drawing on shared understanding and shared experiences. And when you do exactly the examples you gave of India, of China, and others, it's very heartening too, because there was recently a tendency to exclude China from the discourse altogether, to think that, oh, China is out of it, is irrelevant to this. But now we realize that we cannot really go anywhere without a sixth of humanity. Whether we like it or not, massive economies, massive populations. And these are human beings. How can we claim commitment to values to the human by virtue of their humanity, which is what universality of human rights is? It's a commitment to these values and rights to the human being by virtue of her or his humanity and nothing else. I don't have to be anything else than being human to be entitled to these claims and rights. This is really a very advanced achievement to where we have come from in the Second World War, or before that, later on, as recently as even earlier this century. So it is. I think that potential of optimism that we have in the history, but has to be open-minded and open-eyed, not romantic notions, oh, glorious humanity, this and that. Yes, glorious humanity, this and that, but because of this and that, not regardless of this and that. And the this and that includes the negative as well as the positive. But I appreciate very much your patience and welcome to my remarks. And please excuse me, because of my level of my energy is declining fast. So I will not be able to continue with this meeting with you, but I will remain, and as much as I can, come back to listen to your conversations.
I'm
Thank
sure
you
you'll
so
all
much.
join me in thanking Professor An-Naim.